Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone, let's begin. Welcome to the Stoa, a place where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today we have the return of Bonnitta Roy. So I hope everyone heard the hype horn. If not, I'll play it again multiple times. Yes, so Bonnitta is back. Bonnitta was here from the beginning. She was doing something called the Psychotechnology Playground at the Stoa. And I think it went for like almost 15 sessions. And then it ended and my heart was broken. And then since then I was begging Bonnitta to come back. And then she finally relented and she said, okay, I'll be a Sensemaker in residence for October. And the series will be called The Holo. So I'm really excited about that. And so it's the Sensemaker in residence series. It happens over a month for 4 sessions, the same time, the same day. And each series has an MC, and this series MC is Rain Rivera. Rain is, everyone loves Rain. She's freakishly intelligent and awesome, and so we're lucky to have her here. And so I'm going to take in Rain right now. Rain, if you want to say anything more about yourself, introduce Bonnitta, and then she'll talk about the Q&A protocols. And then we'll get started. We're here for 90 minutes in total. So that being said, I will take Rain in.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. I am really honored to be emceeing this session. I joined Bonnitta's last series, maybe at the 2nd session, and was immediately hooked. I find Bonnitta's teachings to be incredibly insightful. She's super well-informed about various sense-making modalities and complexity theory and the systems theory informed sense making that many of us are familiar with, but she also adds an element of what I would call a contemplative or non-dual embodied participatory knowing. So when I got to know her work, I was just so impressed. Epistemologically, it's incredible compared to some of the more conceptual frameworks, sense-making frameworks that are out there. So I'm so excited to be here, and I will let Bonnitta talk about what the Holo is and introduce the session. I assume we will be having a Q&A portion, and for that portion, just put your questions in the chat, prefix them with Q or question so that I can see them, +1 if you think a question is good, and I will field those questions. All right, over to you, Bonnitta.
Wow, this is really exciting. Okay, so the Holo is a neat metaphor and image where you think of like the pre-revolutionary soldier people going into the Holo to discuss the revolution. And here in Connecticut, we have what's called the Charter Oak, where our original charter for Connecticut was hidden inside the hollow of a tree. Hollows are these ravines where you go at night or pre-dawn. So to be secret group of revolutionaries, and it's great to have this run into Halloween. I want to frame this a couple of different ways. This series is an experiment because one of the things we're trying to, or I'm trying to do, or we're all trying to do is talk less about something and immerse into it. So I could blah, blah, blah on the difference between cross-paradigmatic, multi-paradigmatic, and trans-paradigmatic. I teach primarily for, all my workshops are designed for post-formal learners, and post-formal learners are somewhere in this arena. So cross-paradigmatic means I can sit inside of science and look at philosophy, or I could sit inside of structuralism and look at science, right? So I'm crossing from I have one paradigm where I'm looking at the other, and you see this happening, primarily this is what's happening in the Sensemaker space, this level of conversation. And then you'll have multi-paradigmatic, often called trans-paradigmatic, but it's not. And multi-paradigmatic means, yeah, I can enter in quantum mechanics, this framework with you. Let's enter into complexity theory. Let's enter into metapsychology. So I have the ability to occupy many different paradigms and live there. And you also see this as part of the skill you all have in taking these video series. You need to be multi-paradigmatic, or else you'd just be complaining, that you don't get it. What we're going to try to do here is trans-paradigmatic, and that means you're not actually entering into these paradigms as if they were separate worlds, but you're actually kind of having some kind of experience of them melting into each other. And part of this experience in post-formal learning is very synesthetic, visual. If you can use a lot of multimedia to invite the mind not to clamp down and jump into a paradigm, but experience as if you're the sun and there's these constellations of worlds. That's what we're going to try to do. And that's the last definition of the hollow. You have to kind of keep your mind hollow. So the interplay of paradigms, so then you say, well, where are you coming from? And what we're hoping is that where you're coming from takes on a new shape. So this is the conceptual framing of what we're going to do together. And obviously it's very experimental, but I think you all are up for it. So let me share my screen. Oh, let me say this. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to present in this kind of trans-paradigmatic way. The first screen is not like that, it's another frame, but then we're going to get into this trans-paradigmatic presentation. And then for the Q&A, we can come back down to conceptual rationality for questions, so that we can kind of mentalize or get our really be able to chew into some of the concepts. So it's not like the idea is just to not hone in on some teaching points. So the question and A could be more rigorous in a conventional way. All right, so. So what we are going to enter into is, this slide is to remind us of what's in the sense-making series. This is kind of an interesting slide of a civilization that's come and gone, let's say. Here's a remnant of a civilization. And there is this sense that we are working in this sense-making scene with being on the verge of bifurcation events, catastrophic collapse, time in between worlds. So we want to enter into this mean space that is holding a lot of what we do here at the Stoa, right? So this is a slide of some kind of remembrance of that. What we're going to talk about today is over this series are the way we have our metaphysics, how modern minds construe time, change, and causality. And that, in my opinion, these have to actually change to different types of mental models in order for us to move beyond modernity and postmodernity. So a lot of the conversation about civilization collapse, metapsychology, etc., is very interesting. But for me, as long as it's inside the same paradigm, that depends upon modernity's notion of time, modernity's notion of change, and modernity's notion of causality, I don't think it's radical enough. This is the hypothesis in the whole slideshow, in the whole series. So we'll look at these specifically and see if these are actually changing in our consciousness. So how does this fit into some of the other sense-making series? Some of the sense-making series have a geohistorical frame. So we talk about globalism and the rise of neoliberalism, media, the internet, exponential tech, and climate. I would call that a geohistorical frame. They're looking at time, change, and causality inside this geohistorical frame. Others have a developmental frame, the development of the human. So we have cultural complexity, cognitive complexity, and psychological complexity. And they also have a modern notion of time, change, and causality. We're going to look at change. We're going to look at sense making from an evolutionary frame. And with evolution, it's a directionless change, right? So in the geohistorical frame, in the developmental frame, you're always kind of, your notion of causality is always from here to better development, better progress. You know, there's kind of a linear trajectory or direction you're aiming for, but an evolution doesn't have a direction. So we're going to try to think of sense making as a directionless change that happens to us. That's something we can't know beforehand or explain afterwards, but something we can learn how to do. So the great epochal changes in history, like people learning having language, symbolic language, nobody knew how to do that. You couldn't sense make your way into learning language. It's evolutionary change that happens to us. So this is kind of a different way to hold the framing that we're using. Now, the interesting thing is, with an evolutionary frame, you have bifurcation events that change the nature of thought beforehand and the nature of thought afterwards. So it's very hard to use the sense that we make in modernity to predict the sense we will make after modernity, because sense making itself evolves. So for example, in the magical mind, in the epic that Gebser called magical, they didn't like make sense of things. They didn't like try to go out and have common shared explanatory systems. The magical structure of consciousness, the way we would call sense making, is just what works. What works is ritualized and collective mimetic behavior, because what doesn't work dies out. People don't survive. And that's their sense making frame. They never say, why does it work? With the mythical structure of consciousness, you start to have this question, why does it work? And you get a narrative story or a myth about why it works, but there's no empirical correspondence. It's like, why does the sun shine? Because Zeus gets in his chariot. You know, there's not really a one-to-one correspondence. But you see the question of why comes up in the mythical mind. In the mental structure of consciousness is the modern way we think of sense making. So I'm asking you to step back and think, even sense making, even asking like, why can we make sense of the world, or we should be making sense of the world, or there's a war on sense making, has a specific evolutionary epochal time frame of modernity. So this is a really big, you really have to step back and understand this. You want this very, very metacognitive perspective on this, or transparadigmatic. So in mental structure of consciousness and modernity, sense making for us is shared explanations of how it works in order to predict, decide, and control outcomes, right? So the question I just want you to maybe feel into just for a short moment is, when did the world stop making sense for you? And when you feel in that, you'll understand what making sense to you means. That you lost something, or something, the loss of shared explanations, or the loss of predictability and control, or the loss of something, right? So when did the world stop making sense for you? And what does making sense to you mean? You still have the Bible story, right? That would be a mythic explanation. What was removed from that? Now, another thing I want to talk about modernity is, modernity has not made sense for a lot of people, ever. Okay, it doesn't make sense for the orangutan in the palm forest. Of course, that's not a person. It doesn't make sense for the people that, you know, lived through World War I and World War II. It doesn't make sense for the people in the Holocaust. It doesn't make sense for homeless people. It doesn't make sense for a lot of people. For a lot of people, modernity has never made sense. This is just true. This is just true. And for some people, like a 14-year-old girl in Africa who just graduated from school and started an NGO, it's just now beginning to make sense in this notion of sense-making and modernity. So we have to get a really very clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about the war on sense-making. For many people, modernity has never made sense. So this too is an evolving, metamorphing kind of game. So this is the framework in which this series operates in. It's much different than, my work is really much different than a lot of other people in this space. But I want to really enable you to enter into this transparadigmatic view of what we're going to deal with here. So I'm not able to read the chat and do this at the same time. So if you see something come up that needs clarification in the chat, just shout it out. Okay, so let's, that's all framing. Let's enter this. Oh, I think there's one more thing. So in the end, so where are we going? I want to give you the goal when we start, because the in-between is kind of confusing. I'm going to predict that sense-making in the modern sense is shifting from sense-making to sensefulness. I could ramble on for hours about why I think that's the case, but I don't want to do a conceptual kind of evidential thing here. But that's where I think we're going. And that we are moving from an information commons and shared explanation, which is how we try to make sense of things now. And that's in the past. That's like trying to make sense in a magical sense. That I think is not recoverable. And that's okay. Because I think we're moving to an understanding and relational intimacy, what I call senseful co-presence. This is why Yunka Porta is interesting again. And all these, you see all these moves toward what looks like pre-modernity, but it's a hybridization to get out of modernity. So I just give you the end at the beginning so you can see that there's some kind of narrative arc in this presentation. So we don't have to, we could talk about this in the Q&A, that's what the Q&A is for, but we don't have to unpack that right now. I think you can kind of get a hit of what that is. And I think if you think about it, you'll see this is leaking in already. You can see these moves happening. And me, frankly, I don't want to spend my time in the information commons and shared explanation space. I'm a future junkie. All my energy is in like, okay, that's irrevocably past. Can we support, can we birth what wants to emerge? Okay. So for me, the meta and Metamodern, this is part of our sense-making space, must point to the ability to take a perspective on both modernity and post-modernity. Now I lump those two together because they both come from the same metaphysics of time, change, and causality. One's a critique on the other, but they assume the same modern categories of time, change, and causality. So to me, they're the same. And to go meta on that, in the sense of this trans-paradigmatic, is to be able to examine it as if from without. And then there's a really interesting question is like, where is the without? How can we get out of modernity and post-modernity and able to examine it and talk about it? And this is just a little slide that kind of illustrates for me that modernity and post-modernity are in a metaphysical loop because they rely on the same primary categories, metaphysical primes of time, change, and causality. And if you change them, you've changed everything. We can look in the past and see in our evolutionary anthropology that these conceptions have changed and they're changing again. So for me to be sufficiently meta and metamodern is not just to be a next move on this modernity, post-modernity line. It's to categorically change these metaphysical primes and to let them go. So we can look back in time and see that cultural artifacts, art, oral history, philosophy, religion, and science can be read as dispatches from the times. So instead of looking at them and seeing them as past, over, done with, that would be a modern way of looking at time. It's past, it's over, it's done. We can look at them as that they've been written in stone to speak to us as modern people. You see the difference? So instead of looking at them as another time, they're dead, they're over with, now we're here, we can say, no, they've been written in stone to speak to us as modern people. The text is only relevant now. And this is what Gebser saw. This is how the Buddhists think of, maybe the way they thought of the Torah, the Buddhists think of these secret texts, that they're dispatches from their times. We see there were times of deep epochal change when one form of human consciousness was replaced by another. So what they're telling us is, look, you were different before. We were different before. We see periods of in-betweenness when the old structure no longer work, but the new structure is not yet to come. And I would argue we're in a period of in-between now. So what we could do is dispatch what it feels like to be here to our future selves. That what we write and what we say and what we do at the Stoa is a record dispatched to our future selves, and only they will be able to make sense of it. But not in the way we make sense of things, but in the way They are making sense of things. So this is a way to really get into like post-formal learning, like these creative imaginaries. You get out of the time frame of past, present, and future, and you start to create imaginary worlds that could be. So just like we look in the past and we don't, instead of saying that's done and over with, let's be archaeologists about it, we can look into the past as if it's speaking to us. This is who you were. This is what we wanted you to know. And then we can imagine ourselves in the time in between where we're not making sense of things. And what we write and what we think and all the confusion we are in are actually dispatches to our future selves, so they can figure out where we've been. Maybe it's not ours to do. And this shows the continuity of mind in life in time. It's very transpersonal, trans-sequential. Move on. Okay. So here we are. We are in a time zone that has the characteristic of both being a frontier and a war zone. And this is where we're a dispatch, and you want to dispatch things from the war zone back home. You want to dispatch from the frontier back home. And we are in this time zone. We are the explorers and survivors, and we are writing to you, the people of the future. This is what we're doing here in the Holo. We're dispatching what it's like to be in this time between worlds that feels a little bit like a frontier and a little bit like a war zone. And we are writing to you, the people of the future. Perhaps you will be able to make sense of the things that elude us here. See, this is something we can do here in this time in between worlds. Perhaps these dispatches will help you make sense of where you are, knowing how perilous and wayward a journey we have undertaken to get there. This is the sensefulness of this time in between worlds. These writings, this slideshow we'll look at, are dispatches from the time between worlds to a time when a new world takes its place. That's what we do here in the Holo. We're going to hide these dispatches in the hollow of the tree. People discover them when the new world takes its place. The sensefulness of this activity. Now you're going to see each slide switches worlds. So we're playing in this like we really inhabit this world. Now we're going to boop. We're going to work with saying this in a different world. They don't follow sequentially. This is paradigmatic thinking. Okay, so this is an art installation that was inspired by Timothy Morton's notion of hyperobjects. And one of the things, okay, this is a dispatch. I'm going to dispatch this into the future. This dispatch is that the metaphysics that underlie both modernity and post-modernity have not only primed the current meta-crisis. So I would argue, someone said the other day that capitalism, underlies just about everything. And I agree with that. But underneath capitalism is the metaphysics of modernity. Time, change, and causality, how we construe them, made the design of capitalism possible. This is why Indigenous people didn't create capitalism, because they don't understand time, change, and causality different. So I'm saying that not only have they primed the current meta crisis, but they create this reaction in us in which we continue to exert upward pressure towards civilization collapse. So as long as we address the meta crisis from within the metaphysics of modernity and post-modernity, we will continue to exert upward pressure towards civilization collapse. Now, the good news is that the pressure towards civilization collapse is making our heads wobble, like mine, these half-born ideas that we have because our minds can't make sense of things. That upward pressure is also exerting an evolutionary pressure to think outside these categories. So this happened, for example, in the axial age, and Plato was very cognizant that he was using his mind in a different way. He had a word for it called diaresis, which is the word we get dialectical out of. This has happened before. These transmutations, these metamorphic changes in the architecture of mind. So for me, this upward pressure is also a sign that we're using the metaphysics of modernity. And as I keep saying it, modernity means both modernity and its critique, which we call postmodernity. So here's something that I would say is looks like not upward pressure. And this is a quote from David Chandler. In an era of conceptual closure, the metaphysics of modernity and postmodernity, one is modernity, one it's the critic, and the metaphysics are the same, so they close each other. This participation would include, would of necessity include acting our way into new ways of thinking, right? Not trying to make sense in order to choose what to do, but just acting. And the acting itself will catalyze and support new ways of thinking. This is how we learn when we're children. We just act, we act out, we push boundaries. This creates a generative learning loop. And then he writes, to become experimenting, compositional, and playful persons, fully aware of our lack of causal knowledge and confident and at home with contingency and the unexpected. Sensefulness, playfulness, not sense making. To creatively engage with emergence itself, thus turning problems or threats into new opportunities, and to see that the problems themselves point to openings where new opportunities lay. And I really like this slide. I should remember who the artist is. But yeah, and I think a lot of the Stoa sessions are coming into this, right? I mean, the fact that there's so much conceptual stuff in the Stoa sessions, and then there's all this playful irreverence that is held sacred. And to really understand that this is probably the bigger piece of the pie. Like, what would it be to, does this slide make sense? No, but it's senseful. And can we do senseful acts in a playful and compositional way? I think this is what is being called forth. Now, to people who want to make sense of the world, it will seem deviant or silly or stupid or pre-rational or crazy. That's the way they can interpret it. So we're going to talk about metamorphosis. This metamorphosis of mind is driven by pressures that run counter. This is another David Chandler quote or excerpt, adaptation. What we need to know is that it's driven by pressures, so what I call these evolutionary pressures that run counter to the modern mind's upward path. It operates through counter-systemic approaches, okay? So not complexities theory and more systems thinking and more cybernetics and more complexity and more, all this analysis. It runs counter to that. and they destabilize the modern imaginaries of progress, civilization, and development. So what he's saying is that this metamorphosis, he's a post-anthropic writer, which means he decenters from the idea that the humans are at the center of the universe and the human thinking. So what he's saying is that we need to challenge the systemic, what it's like an arms race of complexification around progress, civilization, and development, and challenge our fixed and empty framework of time and space with ourselves at the center. This is part of this metamorphosis. And so when you're doing sense making at this scale, this is what you're trying to, this is like part of your bullshit detector. Like, is that there's always progress and development and civilization must go on and get better. And then there's a techno fix and this and that. This is all part of modernity's impulse and compulsion. As we face environmental destruction at a planetary scale and existential risk at a global scale, we must examine our stories that stick firmly to the modern imaginaries, since they emphasize our separation of nature and destory our shared genealogy with the life force of the earth. So a lot of people talk about in some of these conversations about having a new shared imaginary, but when they say that, they're still inside notions of progress, civilization, developmental bias, and the notion that the people at the center of the universe. It's not radical enough. It's not a new imaginary. It's still stuck in the old story, as Charles Eisenstein would say. And I would say that the new story, as Chandler says, has to be based on a different metaphysics of time, change, and causality. And we're going to look at those three in the next sessions very, very closely. So they're coming, the details coming. So for me, I do not intend to drive thinking up toward increasing complexification. I intend to drive thinking down to its metaphysical roots. That doesn't make it easy to do. It's less complex, but it requires a metacognitive insight down to the fundamental formative metaphysics that constrain our thought. Now, there is this concept of theory constitutive metaphor, which means all our theories are based upon a kind of mental model or a metaphor of how it works. So for example, our conception of time is always spatial, like a timeline. And everything that happens in the going forward is progress, and everything that's in the past is primitive. This is a fundamental metaphor that we use when we talk about civilization. And then we equate progress with complexification. So if it doesn't get more complex, we don't think it's progressive. And we don't aim for that in the future. So these metaphors get us all tangled up into trivial tautologies, really, right? So the same way that we think modernity, you hear this over and over again, and I say it too, and I'm not going to say it anymore. We say modernity has benefited many people, and then here are the problems. Yeah, but that's because we equate modernity with more complex, with it must be better, despite a lot of evidence that modernity has not really been very good for a lot of people and a lot of living creatures. We have no evidence to say that, because all our evidence is based upon the assumption that more complex and a certain type of progress is better. We're in this closed metaphysical loop. And this is what we have to get out of. This is what we need to come to terms with. that maybe modernity is not better than pre-modernity, or maybe there's no way to judge. All you can do is live in the time that you live in. For many people, modernity has not been better. And maybe for the majority of people, it's not better. It's more complex, more technologically sophisticated, but you can't equate that with better and then say, well, then I just proved modernity is better. And that's what we do. We live longer, but we have mental health issues. Oh, but that's better because we can quantify that we live longer. You can't hold court on what better means and doesn't mean, and then prove with that definition that things have gotten better. But you're stuck in a metaphysical loop because modernity only counts some things as better, and those things are modern. Can you see what I'm saying here? This is really important for us to understand the limitations of a closed metaphysical system loop in our minds. Yes, change has happened. It is what it is. There's no way to prove it's better. After a bifurcation event, when we're no longer modern, what is better will be redefined in its own terms, and then you could argue it's better. So we really have to be careful. We really have to have a lot of epistemic humility when we're taking on these projects of speaking from modernity for modernity. We have to look at modernity from another place. And that's a hard move. It doesn't mean the theory gets more complicated, but the metacognitive move is not simple. There's a level of clarity and awareness that is required. And I think this, yeah. So these stories, this is the last slide for today. These stories of separation and alienation are consequences of reasoning from a particular set of metaphysical primes associated with the mental structure of consciousness, from which the modern world and its sequel, the postmodern, are scripted. Perhaps the term modern in Metamodern reflects the continuance of the same old metaphysical architecture in new conceptual bottles, but for me, it signals a response that we must look at modernity from somewhere else, and this somewhere else is our period of latency of a time between worlds. So that's the framing. When we come back, we're going to look at time, and the next session we'll look at change, and then we look at causality, in particular, as they live in the modern mind, and we'll look at alternatives that are in the contemporary imagination.
Thank you, Bonnitta. Are you interested in opening up for questions at this point, or?
Yeah, let's see if there's some questions. And I think we have an hour and 15 minutes. So if we spend 15 minutes on questions, we can preview time, because I think I am going to run out of time in 4 sessions. So we can maybe have 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll run the series on the slides on time, and then that can stew in between the sessions if we don't have enough questions and answers.
Sounds good. So Peter Sforza has a question. Would you like to unmute and ask your question, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Bonnitta. That was great. And thanks, Rain. I had two questions. One was thinking about the Anthropocene, but I think the more relevant one is coming up now about the anecdote or stories of the Tower of Babel and this sort of how presumptuous of us to continue this upward idea that we can create this unification. Have you thought about the Tower of Babel anecdotes with regards to complexity and some of this framing that you're giving?
Yeah, you're right. You're right in my heart space here. From a very early age, I never understood that story. like, why do you want everyone talking the same thing? And I don't know if it's before or after I understood evolution, but I remember very early on, I shuddered. And we know from evolution, you want lots of different ways of making a living. Well, look at this when we get to one of the slides on Donna Haraway, and how what we want is more ways of making a living, more languages, more small commons, more hybridization. When we look at civilization collapse, if we have ecological collapse, the reindeer people will probably live. So then we have to rethink what resilience is. And resilience is not to have one language and one economy and one hyper system. But of course, so that's I call it also symbolic magnification. We used to, every little clan used to have all their totems and all their kings and queens mythology. Now we have, like, you know, symbolic magnification. There's only so many archetypes. They apply to everything. This is a reduction of the human potential. This is a reduction of psychic imaginary. All these things are highly reductive, and therefore, because they've capitalized under a few winners, you know, there's 3 or 4 big archetypes, they're very fragile. It's not resilient. And so you can see in a lot of the conversation on civilization collapse, even if they're talking about resilience, they're still looking for, like, we need a shared common imaginary. We need it's still in the wrong direction. And that's the developmental bias of progress, is an accumulation of a unification kind of thing. So for me, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And yeah, that I get that hit right there with the Tower of Babel story.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. I like the resilience comment too. It's my saying for the summer has been that consilience ate resilience for breakfast, and meaning that we still need to be resilient, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, and when we look at change, we're going to look closely at the panarchy cycle and how people have co-opted the notion of resilience and turned it into the same logics that has brought us to fragility. Like, we just can't get out of that mindset.
Okay, question from Kim. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Bonnie.
Hi, Kim.
Thanks for this. This is just, you know, it feels like you're really pulling together a lot of felt senses that, and tangibilizing them with beautiful pictures, by the way. And the question, I mean, this is just, you answered a little bit of it just now with the multiple languages, but my question is, okay, we are in this, you know, in between worlds things. And the ability for us to go forward, as I get, and with what you're saying, is for us to use completely different ways of being together. And how do we, and then I hate how questions, but what is the language that we use as we interplay with others, and particularly perhaps those who are really based in the modern, postmodern world, to engage at this, or begin to engage at this level. I mean, this is always the question. Well, how do we do this? How do we do this? So I'm going to throw it back at you, but kind of with that idea of languages and being senseful within this context that we're in this limbic space between worlds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't know how we talk about that. I don't know how we language that. I think we experiment, which we all are doing. Hopefully, one of the skills this session will build is try not to do that. And then if you try not to do that, then you have nothing to put in its place. And then you just have to be there. Like, if I don't think of if, then, how do I think of change? And then this is a great meditation. This is I shared this story in one of my Stoa sessions when I was doing this dialogue, this workshop in San Francisco. And then Soryu Foral said, what if there's no if and no then? Now something cracks in my head. That whole way of trying to figure out causality without if then, he made me aware that the if then itself is a certain assumption. Can we examine why the brain does that? Why does your mind do that? What if I don't let my mind do that? Well, maybe then I go and drink a beer, or if I'm Peter Lindbergh, I smoke a cigar. I don't know. But you start to really understand the nature of that mind. Now, I'm riffing because you guys are going to ask questions that are previewing what we're going to be doing, but then this will give us capacity when it comes on. And so another reason why I call this the Holo is because your mind is like the hollow of a tree. Be careful of what you put in there, right? And now I'm not going to go to the Buddhist thing and say your mind should be empty. I think your mind should be creative, and you should be aware of the constructs, the fundamental metaphors that you use to examine something. And how do we change those? How do we change those now? Here's where your mind goes. Okay, how do I change those so the world gets better? You see, that's what comes in. It wants to come in. How do I examine that so it gets better? And then you say, oh, no, I have to let that orientation go too. We know change happens. Why am I preoccupied with this qualitative measurement of better when I just said there's no way to know what better is? Because when catastrophic change happens, what we say is better also changes because our mindset will change. So if you're lucky, these kinds of things that you do when you're meditating on these things create fun and enjoyment, and you laugh because it's like kids when they can't get out of a maze and they laugh, but they're really trying. And if you're not lucky, it drives you crazy and you commit suicide or something. But that's something of the process that goes into here. And and I'm sharing quotes from people who've written cool books that I call them post-anthropic, and we like to get them on the Stoa. We're talking about that. But these things are happening in people's minds. To be able to, to think in this way, to experiment in this way, and we'll meet some of them as we go on. And so one of the reasons why I'm doing all this framing is because you can read them and you can capitalize it with a modern mindset. And if you read these people carefully, they're saying something else. I think they're saying something more like we're saying here. One of the biggest breakthroughs that we had when I was running a lot of collective insight processes here is there was a group that was meeting quite often, and we were examining the contraction you have when you're not understood by other people. got foregrounded once. We realized that some of the tension that seemed to be going on was really that there was a fear. Someone said, "Oh no, it's a fear." And at first it was like, I don't feel like I belong, but that was like stupid. And what we did was this thought experiment. We said, how much of my experience, like if two people see an accident and the cop asks each one of them what happened, you'll get two different stories, sometimes very competing stories. Even when we look at the freaking cameras on the cops, it doesn't adjudicate the perspectival nature of the experience. So then we said, here, sitting here in this collective space, how much experience you think we're actually sharing? Like, we realized that we had this assumption that we were sharing the same experience, but that our language was different, right? So we were trying to semantically map and make sure that we're all on the same page. And we realized that maybe we weren't having the same experience. Then we did this thought experiment. What if we actually share no experience, zero, no meaning making, no sense making? Everything we say we live in our own little bubble. And we all got, like, you know, when you're in these sense making spaces, it's quite psychoactive. And then we realized that the world would still hang together. So then we realized that the whole construction of that question is just based upon some kind of faulty metaphor of, do things connect or they don't connect and stuff like that. Like the whole thing is based upon assumptions that things connect in a certain way, that things are shared in a certain way, that things make sense in a certain way. And we realize, yeah, actually they do connect, they do make sense, and there is meaning, but we have no freaking idea how. And there's no sense to try to make that happen, because it either doesn't happen or doesn't happen, which case it's not a question at all. Because we got something like that. And this is kind of a little bit of the attitude about evolutionary change. It's not something we can work on, it works on us. So, you know, it looks like I'm working on it because I'm working in it, but there's a sense in which you're not a naive realist, but you naively take reality to be real, and that it works, and that you can trust it, and it does what it does, and you can't do any better. There's a certain smell in these sense-making spheres. I call it the God problem. You probably heard me talk about it before, because I mean, this liberated me. I worked so hard to help people and make humanity healthy. And then I realized that it's like you have a God problem, that you think you could do better than nature or cosmogenesis or God. Like, you really think you can figure it out, right? And this is not possible. It's not possible to operate on the world from that leverage point, that vantage point. So then the question is, how can you operate in the world? You have a vantage point to operate in the world. So, yeah, but what you can do is operate on your mind from that vantage point. It's just really, really hard to do, to understand that these are the traps that these loops that you're stuck in.
Thank you. I just want to also say what I'm discovering is operating with the world. And that's that creativity that what you're talking about is you're watching your mind, you're groping, you're playing, you're watching your mind, you're groping. And it's this fun, but kind of wild ride almost.
Yeah, it's a wild ride.
Yeah, thanks.
So, Bonnitta, we're at the 15 minutes of Q&A. So you said you wanted to move on to some slides on time. There's some great questions in the chat, and I just want to highlight a couple and let you decide, Bonnitta, whether you want to answer them now or later, because they're definitional questions. And as this is the first session, that might be valuable. So there was one question on the definition of better.
Yeah.
And then there's another question on your definition of metaphysics.
Okay, yeah, no, I said if we didn't have enough questions, we could do that. But this is, I think we should spend time on the questions. Okay, so the question of better. A lot of these questions I have to pivot to stories because it gets way too complicated to meta-theorize around it. But one of the things we'll look at, we'll look at this notion of better progress later. But I use the term, I borrowed it from Yunka Porta. He talked about, he said, my people, we don't have this notion of progress. We have this notion of increase. And I wrote that in a paper, and the editor said, I can't see any difference. Like, so it's very tricky because we can't say increase. Eventually we see it as better or progress, right? And we can see increase seems quantitative. How can I understand that qualitative? So it's very hard. It took me a while to figure out how to relate to this term increase without subtly having this notion of better or progress. So this is very, very hard to do. The fact that it's hard to do makes me very stubborn because like I don't want my brain to like clamp down like that, right? So in the paper, we're working on a paper I wrote. This part of this is this research I did. I was trying to figure out how to explain to this editor that increase doesn't mean progress. And so the metaphor I used is, and let me see, and tell me if this works. I'm trying to decouple the notion of increase with progress. And so I wrote the way increase, the way frost concentrates sugar in the fruit, or the way trouble concentrates conversation. So for me, increase is this notion of concentration, not accumulation. So that's one way of relating that I relate to this notion of increase. But I don't really know how Yunka Porta's native or natural way of relating to that word is. So that's not increasing complexification, the way trouble concentrates conversation. You wouldn't say that was progress. You wouldn't say it necessarily complex, doesn't have to complexify. You might not be able to talk, but it increases. It's like becomes more senseful. And if you know about wine and stuff and why birds eat the berries off the trees after the winters, because the fruit gets concentrated. So that's the metaphor that I thought of, but it's not easy to come into relationship with the term increase without conflating it with better or progress. Is it better to have trouble when you're trying to talk to someone? No, I wouldn't say it's better. Was that helpful for that question? I mean, it's like a handicap in working at this level of insight.
That's great. Did you want to say anything about your definition of metaphysics?
Oh, yes. So I should have said that at first. So I have, I use Charles Hartshorne's definition of metaphysics. And metaphysics is like the deepest categories or metaphors or mental models that underline and make thought possible, but also constrain thought to those metaphors, that architecture, those movements, those categories. Okay, so I call them metaphysical primes. They're very, very, very deep in structuration of thought, and not even conceptual thought, even reaction, like you see something and you move this way or that way, or right and left brain schemas is really a very, very deep metaphysics, right? Because we're constrained to that bicamerality. Yeah, so are they accessible? Yeah, that's what we're doing here. And I suppose the ones that are not accessible, we're not going to be working with them. But a lot of, you know, that's what insight practice is for me. I think collective insight practice, the way I teach it, is trying to get at these really deep habits of, or architecture or schemas of thought. So we can disembed from the constraints. And when Whitehead, for example, wrote Process and Reality, he was doing speculative metaphysics. He knew he was. He thought that there was a usefulness for it to come up with reasonable theories of the way the world might work based on different ways of looking at, for him, change and relationship. And we'll look at some of Whitehead's metaphysics as alternatives to the metaphysics of modernity.
Thank you. Are you good for more questions, Bonnitta?
Yeah, we'll just they're great questions. And I think, you know, the more understanding we can get now, once we get into the conceptual territory, the more, the better it'll be.
Great. Better. Lots of...
It'll increase our experience.
Very good.
Hugely.
Yeah.
Bigly.
Concentrate that wisdom. Peter Limberg, lots of +1s.
All right. So there's a question here, Bonnitta, but if anything is salient for you, feel free to respond to it. So I'll read it out. Recently, in stewarding the Stoa, others have been encouraging me to scale this place, have collective goals for it, etc. This is somewhat scrambling the way I've been operating here since the beginning, really, what I've referred to as listening to the daemon. Feeling into this pressure on a sensefulness level, I sense like urgency, and behind that I sense fear. On a propositional level, I hear, see modernist frameworks, goals, scaling truth, etc. What is the interplay, if any, between having a bad relationship with fear and modernity's proclivity for control?
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to tell you how I teach fear in my course, because we do a module on the affects. So fear is a contracted form of seeking. They're anatomically, neurochemically, and neurodynamically in the same path. So if you have fear, you ask your question, so you can feel the toggle, right? So when you're in the woods and you're looking for something, then there's fear, right? So fear is the energy of seeking contracted. So what you want to do is use its energy for free, and you want to try to orient it toward to the seeking. What are you seeking? Well, you don't really know, because the daemon is seeking. So you can orient toward the seeking itself. And you're going to toggle between high times and fear, because it's the same neuroanatomical, neurodynamical path. This is true for animals also. Now, the expanded form of fear and seeking is awe. That's the highest expanded form, and that's also in the same path. So the Vajrayana awe is the baby sister of awe is fear. In the middle sun is seeking, and the grand old dam at the end is just standing in awe. And this woman, Diane Eileen Russell, she noticed, she's the one that put this together, this framework together, and she called them the tremulous energy. Because when you're fearful, you're trembling. And when you're seeking, and you're trembling. And when you're standing in awe, you're trembling. And she started to see these vagal patterns and stuff like that. So when you're working with fear, you just know it's energy for free. It's seeking energy. It still has energy. It's just a little contracted because you can't like, boom. You can't like be in the expanded form all the time. There's always breathing in and breathing out. So that can be your friend. That can be your friend. Is that helpful, or do we want a clarifying question?
That's very helpful, and something I'm going to noodle on. I also wonder if you had anything about the other part of the question, how it relates to modernity. Is there something like inherently pathologically embedded in modernity? They don't have a good relationship with fear.
I would say that the beginning of your question was right. You're detecting some kind of pathology of modernity to make more sense of what you're doing, to wrap it up, I mean, I feel that too. I mean, okay, I'm not very proud of this, but like, sometimes I want to be more like them because I get bigger likes on your Stoa channel. I get more watching. You know, I mean, this happens in our mind. It's like, Bonnie, if you just got like real, then maybe, you know, if you just downloaded your conceptual territory. But that's not what we're seeking. You see, that's not what's operating in us. So I get it. And there's no right or wrong in this. It's just where's the energy moving? And you know, there's lots and lots of good video channels, and I think that I don't think they have a very long shelf life, except maybe Joe Rogan. And you know, I think what the trade-offs you're making, I think they're really, as long as they keep increasing, like, you know, then maybe it's a good formula, you know. But yeah, it's not going to, you're not going to get like the ratings or the spoils of modernity if you're not playing that game. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we're at the 75-minute mark. I want to ask you, Bonnitta, if you'd like.
If you have one or two more questions that are standing out. Sorry about the dogs.
Question from Andy. I pasted it in the chat. Andy, feel free if you'd like to ask your question.
So, Bonnitta, the whole process of doing the Holo, if we look at it metacognitively, how do we incorporate play rather than using a modernist framework of a lecture-based format? Because what we're doing here is no different than, you know, a Platonic framework of dialogue or talking at, and I'm trying to cohere that with the content of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's funny because I heard you say play, and then when you said Platonic, I heard P-L-A-Y, tonic, Platonic. Okay, so see, there you go. So I quite often seem illogical or have performative contradiction. I happen to think this is a form of high play. Like for me, it's quite playful. I understand the cognitive load and the conceptual burden, and for some people, this doesn't seem playful. I spent a lot of time choosing the music at the beginning. Because I think it's in your face and it's playful. And then I think energetically, I try to have playful energy. But is it as good as like rolling in the hay and then sitting back and talking about modernity? No. I mean, now I'm going to say this, that, yeah. So I would say this is Platonic, hopefully. Maybe I'll look over my slides and see if I can't put in some that are more play-like because of that comment. I don't, how would you make it more playful? I think the technology itself is not very fun.
Well, it's something for all of us to think about. But I'm wondering if just thinking about the structure of the Holo or the Stoa, or Peter's concerns in a modernistic framework of fear and control, if we throw all those out and go back to primitive, how would that look? How would our interactivity be, though limited by Zoom, be playful? Because we're kind of operating on the perception that there's a goal to be had by doing the Holo. There's an endpoint of skill sets or thought processes we want to evolve to after 4 sessions. And I guess what I'm confused about is, do I or the Stoa, and this is to Peter's journal from 2 or 3 nights ago, should there be a goal orientation, which is very modern, postmodernistic, to the Stoa or not?
Okay, that's a great reframe. All right, I think that one of the goals of, let's say, the Holo is to build a skill. There's some skill building things in here that I'm trying to sneak in, but one is to be able to be aware of your architecture of your mind. Now, just the way I talked to Peter about fear and seeking, play is in the mastery stream. So we think of play, play is not just light, sports and training and martial arts, all that is play. And play builds skills. And so one of the, we could build skills here. And primarily the one we're building is metacognitive capacity, and that's a kind of play in the mastery sense. So Peter and I have talked a lot about what if every conversation could build a skill. That doesn't mean it has a goal, right? I can teach you how to shoot a gun and your goals could be whatever. And so we actually talked about that, like that could be a guiding principle where every conversation builds a skill, doesn't download content, doesn't aim for a goal. And so that's, I think, very close to what you're asking. And I would say that the skill here is, in the sense of mastery, is metacognitive awareness, being able to really get out and see modernity from a place outside of the categories of modernity, just a little bit. So that's one thing. It's not as goal-oriented as some of these other things. The second thing that I'm interested in, and I had this conversation before with people that are also sense-making, some of my friends and colleagues, because I was wondering, what is the difference in my approach than other people's approaches? And I came in dialogue with someone, I came to the conclusion that in many respects, other people have an implicit goal. They kind of know what better is. They kind of know that they want to tweak the system in this way and not others. And what I'm all about is injecting novelty into the system. I don't know what way it wants to go, but we're so habituated that I just want to inject novelty into the system. And then I trust that as it gets shaken up, it's going to go where it wants to go, because that's the inevitable anyways. It's going to be what it is. So my orientation to my work is to inject novelty in the system. And in many other cases, and this might be the pressure that Peter is, well, where are you going with this? And so that's another distinction that I would make. Yeah. Was that helpful? Close to the best I can do.
Okay, question from Tanya Hewitt. If you're here, you can ask your question.
So, Bonnitta, I just wanted to thank you so much for this. This is, you know, when I was doing my doctorate, there I had one single lecture on Indigenous understanding of reality. And just as you were talking, I was just wondering if you believe that Indigenous peoples, the ones who are kind of faithful to the way that they have traditionally lived, are senseful in the way that they live.
Okay, so this is an opinion, and there's always like a certain kind of territory I enter in when it's just an opinion, like I relate to it as an opinion. I think there's very, very few Indigenous people left on the planet. Most of them are modern people from a certain culture, okay? So, you see, it's hard, right? Were they more senseful in the past? Yeah, I would say in my definition of senseful, it's comes after going through modernity. So I would say Indigenous people are more like sensing. Their perceptual organs are in many cases, if they're truly Indigenous, as that word means, are usually more alive. You know, they can smell things, they can see things. They have more what we would call direct perception, sensory awareness. But I think sensefulness for me, I'm using the term as if you have to have gone through, not individually, but humans have to go through modernity. Even as an Indigenous person, you go through modernity suffering it, let's say. You didn't capitulate to it, but you've gone through it suffering it. Does that help? So the way I'm using that word, that's where I want it to function. Indigenous people who never suffered modernity are not the same as Indigenous people who suffer modernity. It's a different thing, and I'm not sure there are any of the other yet anymore. Okay, that was a great question. One more, if it's highlighted, but I don't want to brain drain us on this and then destroy the fun.
Yeah, I think I'm going to call it now, Bonnitta. We just have a couple minutes left. Seems like a good stopping point, and I want to give you a chance to share any closing remarks or foreshadow our next session before I hand it over to Peter.
Yeah, these are all great questions, and the ones that you probably are going to be asking, I think they'll unfold as we look at the detail and we get the hang of it. I'm so happy. It seems like there's a certain amount of tangibleness that has landed with you, and this is very, very high skill. that you are showing up with. And hopefully y'all come back next week because, yeah, we can build on what we're doing today.
Awesome. Thank you, Bonnitta. Peter.
Awesome. Thank you, Rain, and thank you so much, Bonnitta. This is awesome. The series is congealing a bunch of kind of threads for me, and I imagine a lot of people here at the Stoa. Yeah, so I'm going to plug a bunch of events. Just on the Indigenous thread, we have Kim Tallbear coming in to talk about settler sexualities on November 6th. Maybe Gray's going to host that one. It's kind of related to the pressures of modernity that we were speaking on. And next week, we're going to launch a really, really cool series, which I'm excited about. And I might, you know, with my adjunct researcher status at John Vervaeke's lab, we might have some kind of interplay with it. It's Communitas Club. This is with Margaret, who's also in the room. We're going to explore all these sort of we space, intersubjective, and conversational modalities. We have Forrest Landry's ephemeral process. We have kind of like reflective structured dialogues. We have circling, entangled bodies. So that series is going to launch I think that's a Tuesday, October 13th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time. And so you can help design it with us too, because that's what the launch is about, to kind of design this. Maybe we can import these practices in like we have with collective presencing or empathy circles, and then maybe just mix them together, have bespoke psychotechnology, which brings me to the next event I'll plug. Christian, could you unmute yourself and plug your session called Bespoke Psychotechnology that's coming up? If you're still in the room, Christian. Oh, did Christian leave? Oh, there you are. Well, we can't hear you. Maybe I'll just mouth, maybe just speak it and I'll just mouth. So anyways, Christian, he's on mute. He's doing a session that's coming at the Stoa. Let me find a date. October 24th. It's bespoke psychotechnology. So the idea is taking all these different psychotechnologies, life practices, how can we stack them together, mix them up to create our own to kind of respond to the moment? So like DIY psychotechnology. And then we have another event coming up. Kim, could you plug the event coming up in about 30 minutes?
Sure. Yeah, Ria Bach, who has worked with Bonnie, and it's called Collective Presencing, and maybe some of you have heard about it. I would just say it's part of what this practice is that we've been talking about today, and the skills building about sort of listening collectively to emergence, yeah, sort of speaking to and from the middle. And that's happening, yeah, in 30 minutes and for an hour and a half. But there's also going to be another one for Central European timers that we think is going to be on Fridays at 1:30 Central European time. So that could be helpful because we're getting a lot of people.
Very cool. Thank you, Kim. Yeah, this growing the collective presence was quite exciting. Lastly, our boy Tyson Wagner, you got two events to plug, and it's very playful. So if you're going to mute yourself and talk about those.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. Thank you, Rain and Bonnie. I really look forward to the rest of the series. Yeah, the session on Sundays is Flowing with Unknowingness at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. And it's a very playful space. And so I encourage you to come and see it as an opportunity to take some risks, be fearless and play, and experiment as radically and wildly as you like with the way that you communicate and express yourself with words or sounds or otherwise. And then that's sort of the place where we can build a skillfulness and a confidence with the modality. And then on Mondays, following Daniel Schmachtenberger's Digital Porch, we will engage in a dialectic through freestyle rap and spoken word, and practice rap unbattles. So if rap battles typically are to tear each other down, let's see how we can use this modality together to sharpen our thinking and to have a lot of fun together and build each other up. And no experience rapping required. If you can speak and use your words or even just make sounds, then I invite you to come participate. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll echo what Bonnie was saying. I have no idea what this space called the Stoa is all about, but I know we're here to play. So that being said, you can check out the website for more events, the Patreon, and the Substack, the mailing list. So again, Bonnie, Rain, thank you, and everyone for coming today to play with us.